Rain pattered against the windshield as Officer James Miller sat in his patrol car, scanning the quiet streets of Cedar Heights. The orange glow of streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, creating an eerie atmosphere on this otherwise routine evening shift. His radio crackled with occasional chatter, but something about tonight felt different. Through his rain-streaked window, he spotted a dark blue Mercedes approaching. The car was well-maintained and obviously expensive, but something made Miller's hand instinctively move toward his computer. He'd been having a rough week, with 3 suspects slipping through his grasp, and his supervisor breathing down his neck about improving his arrest numbers. The Mercedes drove past, and Miller noticed the driver, an older black woman wearing what appeared to be a business suit. Without hesitation, he pulled out behind the vehicle and flipped on his lights. In his mind, he'd already decided there must be something suspicious about such an expensive car in this neighborhood at this hour. The Mercedes pulled over smoothly, coming to a perfect stop well off the road, clearly someone who knew proper traffic stop procedure. Miller approached the vehicle, his flashlight beam dancing across the pristine paint job. The woman inside sat perfectly still, both hands visible on the steering wheel, her posture straight and professional. "License and registration," Miller barked, not bothering with the usual pleasantries. The rain had picked up, running down his neck and souring his mood further. "Good evening, officer," the woman responded calmly, her voice carrying years of authority. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" "Your taillight's out," Miller lied, knowing full well both lights were working perfectly. He'd review his own dashcam footage later and see the truth, but right now, he didn't care. "I had all my lights checked just yesterday," she replied, maintaining her composure. "I'm actually running late for an important meeting, but I'm happy to step out and verify with you." Something about her confidence irked Miller. Rather than accept her reasonable offer, he felt his temper rising. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded, his hand resting on his belt. The woman complied without argument, though her eyes reflected disappointment rather than fear. She emerged gracefully, her expensive suit now getting damp in the rain. Despite her impeccable appearance and obvious professionalism, Miller felt emboldened to push further. A small crowd had begun to gather at the nearby bus stop, several people quietly filming with their phones. Miller ignored them, focused entirely on finding some reason to justify his growing hostility. "I'm going to need you to submit to a search," he declared, no probable cause in sight. Up against the car. "Officer," she spoke firmly but respectfully, "I'm Dr. Patricia Washington, and I'm late for a meeting with the City Council. There's no legal basis for this search, and we both know it." Her use of logic and calm assertion of rights pushed Miller over the edge. In a moment that would soon come to haunt him, he reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest." The absurdity of charging someone with resisting arrest while they stood perfectly still, following every instruction, was lost on Miller in that moment. The gathered crowd murmured in disbelief, their phone cameras capturing every second of this abuse of power. Dr. Washington allowed herself to be cuffed, maintaining her dignity even as the rain soaked through her expensive suit. "Officer Miller," she said, reading his nameplate, "I want you to remember this moment. Remember how it feels to make this choice." As Miller guided her toward his patrol car, he had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. He couldn't know that this traffic stop would soon become the talk of the entire department, or that his next morning would bring the most uncomfortable meeting of his career. For now, he was simply another officer letting his prejudices guide his actions, about to learn a lesson that would change not only his career, but his entire worldview. The dash camera silently recorded everything, its unblinking eye-capturing evidence that would soon make its way across every desk in the police department. Thunder rolled in the distance, as if nature itself was expressing disapproval at the scene unfolding on this rain-soaked street corner. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Dr. Washington sat quietly in the holding area. Other officers began throwing concerned glances her way, especially after checking her credentials. The night shift supervisor, Lieutenant Chen, rushed over after reviewing the initial report, his face showing growing alarm with each detail he read. "Dr. Washington," Lieutenant Chen said, approaching her with a set of keys, "I cannot apologize enough for this situation. We're dropping all charges immediately." His hands trembled slightly as he removed her handcuffs, already imagining the storm this incident would bring. Meanwhile, Officer Miller sat at his desk, typing up his version of events. He was so focused on justifying his actions that he didn't notice the unusual amount of whispered conversations and worried looks from his colleagues. One of the desk sergeants kept shaking his head while reading something on his computer screen, occasionally glancing at Miller with a mix of pity and disappointment. "You really messed up this time," Officer Rodriguez whispered as she passed by Miller's desk. "You should look up who you just arrested." But Miller brushed off her warning, convinced he'd done nothing wrong. He'd made hundreds of traffic stops before. What made this one so special? Dr. Washington declined the offer of a ride home, instead calling her own driver. As she waited in the station's lobby, she pulled out her phone and made several quick calls. Her voice carried through the quiet station, professional and measured, but the contents of her conversations made several nearby officers freeze in their tracks. "Yes, Mayor Richardson, I'm still planning to accept the position," she said clearly. "In fact, tonight's experience has only confirmed how much work needs to be done." She paused, listening. No need to delay tomorrow's announcement. I think it's better if we proceed as planned." The night shift dispatcher, who had been eavesdropping while pretending to file paperwork, nearly dropped her coffee. She quickly typed something into the department's internal messaging system, and within minutes, the entire station was buzzing with nervous energy. Officer Miller remained oblivious to the growing tension. He finished his report, embellishing details to justify the arrest, and headed to the break room for coffee. The usually chatty room fell silent as he entered, other officers suddenly finding reasons to leave or become deeply interested in their phones. "Hey, Miller," called out Officer Thompson, an older cop known for his straight talk. "You might want to clean out your locker tonight." "Just saying." But Miller just rolled his eyes, convinced his colleagues were overreacting to what he considered a routine arrest. As the night shift wore on, security footage from Miller's dashcam made its way through the department's internal system. Officers gathered in small groups, watching the video with growing disbelief. The complete lack of probable cause, the perfectly functioning taillights, and Dr. Washington's impeccable behavior made Miller's actions look even worse than they had initially seemed. Lieutenant Chen spent the last hours of his shift making phone calls and preparing reports. He knew tomorrow would bring changes to the department, and not everyone would survive the shakeup. As he watched Miller confidently clock out for the night, he couldn't help but shake his head at the young officer's ignorance. "See you tomorrow, Lieutenant," Miller called out cheerfully as he left, completely unaware that his next shift would be very different from anything he could imagine. The automatic doors closed behind him, and several officers let out breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. In the parking lot, Miller passed Dr. Washington's Mercedes being picked up by her driver. The car's taillights glowed bright and clear in the pre-dawn darkness, a silent testimony to the lie that had started this whole situation. But Miller didn't give it a second glance as he headed home, still convinced he'd done nothing wrong. The sun was just beginning to rise as the night shift ended, its golden rays painting the police station in warm light. None of the departing officers knew exactly what would happen in a few hours, but they all knew one thing. Tomorrow would be a day no one in the department would ever forget. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the previous night's rain. Officer Miller strode into the police headquarters at 8 a.m. sharp, his polished badge catching the morning light. The lobby was unusually crowded, with officers from every shift gathered around, all dressed in their formal uniforms. Something big was clearly happening. "Mandatory department meeting in 10 minutes," announced the front desk officer, not quite meeting Miller's eyes. "Everyone's required to attend." The usual morning banter was noticeably absent, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that Miller couldn't quite understand. The large conference room was packed when Miller arrived. He spotted some familiar faces but noticed many high-ranking officials he'd never seen before. The mayor himself sat in the front row, along with several city council members. Miller squeezed into a seat near the back, next to Officer Rodriguez, who immediately scooted her chair away from him. "What's going on?" he whispered, but she just shook her head and looked straight ahead. The room fell silent as Chief Harrison stepped up to the podium, his face more serious than usual. "Good morning, everyone," the chief began. "As you know, our department has been searching for a new police commissioner to lead our reform initiatives. Today, I'm honored to introduce someone who brings decades of experience in law enforcement and a doctorate in criminal justice reform. Miller's phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from his partner warning him to brace himself. Before he could check it, the chief's next words froze him in place. "Please join me in welcoming our new police commissioner, Dr. Patricia Washington." The room erupted in applause as Dr. Washington walked onto the stage, wearing a crisp blue suit that somehow looked even more impressive than it had the night before, despite its recent encounter with the rain. Miller felt the blood drain from his face as he recognized the woman he'd arrested just hours ago. As the applause died down, Dr. Washington took the podium. Her eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on Miller before addressing the crowd. "Thank you all for that warm welcome. Though I must say, some of you already gave me quite an interesting introduction last night." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Miller sank lower in his seat, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. He noticed several officers glancing his way, their expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed satisfaction. "My first priority as commissioner," Dr. Washington continued, "will be addressing the systematic issues that lead to biased policing. Last night, I experienced firsthand what many citizens in our community face regularly. A routine traffic stop based on a non-existent violation escalated into an arrest with no probable cause." The projector screen behind her lit up, showing footage from Miller's dashcam. He watched in horror as his own actions played out before the entire department. The working taillights, his aggressive tone, the completely unnecessary arrest. Each moment felt like another nail in his career's coffin. "This incident," Dr. Washington said, her voice firm but not angry, "will serve as a teaching moment for our entire department. Changes are coming, and they're coming fast." Miller felt sweat beading on his forehead as the video continued to play. Next to him, Officer Rodriguez whispered under her breath, "Man, you really picked the wrong person to mess with." The meeting continued for another hour, with Dr. Washington outlining her plans for departmental reform, new training programs, community outreach initiatives, stricter accountability measures. With each announcement, Miller felt his future in law enforcement growing more uncertain. As the meeting wrapped up, Dr. Washington made one final announcement. "Officer Miller, please report to my office immediately after this meeting. We have much to discuss about last night's events and your future with this department." Miller sat frozen in his chair as the room emptied around him. A few officers patted his shoulder sympathetically as they passed, while others simply shook their heads. Through the windows, he could see the sun still shining brightly outside, but somehow the day had grown much darker. The walk to the commissioner's office would be the longest of his career, each step bringing him closer to a conversation that would change everything he thought he knew about being a police officer. The walk to Commissioner Washington's office felt like walking to his own execution. Miller's footsteps echoed through the empty hallway, each step heavier than the last. The polished nameplate on her door already displayed her new title, making last night's mistake feel even more real. "Come in, Officer Miller," Dr. Washington called out before he could even knock. She sat behind her desk, his personnel file open in front of her. The morning sun streaming through the window cast her in silhouette, making her appear even more imposing. "Commissioner, Miller began, but she held up her hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "We have a lot to discuss." Her voice wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. It carried the weight of disappointment mixed with determination. As Miller sat, she opened a laptop and turned it toward him. "Let's review your record together, shall we?" The screen showed a spreadsheet of his traffic stops over the past year. The racial disparity in his arrest numbers was painfully obvious, even to him. "Interesting pattern here," she noted, scrolling through the data. "Would you care to explain why minority drivers make up 80% of your stops, despite being only 20% of our community's population?" Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time, he saw his actions laid bare in cold, hard numbers. The statistics told a story he couldn't deny, no matter how much he wanted to. I was just doing my job," he stammered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Were you?" Dr. Washington leaned forward. "Last night, you claimed my taillight was out. The dash cam shows it working perfectly. You conducted an illegal search with no probable cause. You arrested me for resisting arrest when I was fully compliant. Is that what you think your job is, Officer Miller? The silence in the room was deafening. Outside, they could hear the usual bustle of the police station, phones ringing, officers talking, life going on as normal. But in this office, time seemed to stand still. Most people in my position would fire you on the spot, she continued, closing the laptop. It would be the easy solution, but easy solutions rarely create lasting change. Miller's head snapped up, surprise evident on his face. Was she saying he still had a job? Instead, Dr. Washington said, pulling out a thick folder, I'm giving you a choice. Option 1, immediate resignation. Option 2, a 6-month rehabilitation program I'm developing. It won't be easy. You'll be reassigned to community service, undergo extensive bias training, and work directly with the communities you've harmed. She spread out several documents on her desk. The choice is yours, but make it carefully. This isn't just about saving your job, it's about becoming the kind of officer our community actually needs. Miller stared at the papers before him, his mind racing. The easy path would be to resign, to walk away and try to find another job. But something in Dr. Washington's voice, the same calm authority she'd shown during her arrest, made him pause. Why? He finally asked. Why give me a second chance after what I did? Dr. Washington stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city they both served. Because, Officer Miller, change has to start somewhere. Last night, you showed me exactly what's wrong with this department. Today, you have the opportunity to be part of fixing it. She turned back to face him, her expression serious but not unkind. So, what's it going to be? Are you ready to learn from this, or would you rather walk away? The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence as Miller contemplated his options. Through the office window, he could see patrol cars coming and going, officers starting their daily routines. His whole career, everything he thought he knew about being a police officer, hung in the balance of this moment. Finally, he reached for the rehabilitation program paperwork. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the pen, but his voice was steady as he spoke. I want to do better. I want to learn. A slight smile crossed Dr. Washington's face, not of victory, but of hope. Then let's begin, she said, opening another folder. Your real training starts now. Miller's first day of rehabilitation began at the local community center, far from his usual patrol route. Gone was his police uniform, replaced by civilian clothes. Instead of his patrol car, he found himself helping elderly residents with their groceries and tutoring kids after school. Never thought I'd see a cop doing this, muttered one of the older residents, an African-American grandmother who eyed him suspiciously as he carried her shopping bags. Her words stung, but Miller kept quiet, remembering Dr. Washington's instructions about listening more than speaking. The community center buzzed with activity. Children played basketball in the gym, seniors gathered for bingo, and local volunteers ran food drives. Miller had driven past this building hundreds of times on patrol, but he'd never once stepped inside. Now he was seeing a side of the community he'd never bothered to know. You're the officer from the video, aren't you? Asked a teenage boy during homework help hours. The question made Miller freeze. The footage of Dr. Washington's arrest had spread through social media, becoming a talking point in the community. Yes, Miller admitted, bracing himself for anger or hostility. But the boy just nodded thoughtfully. My uncle got stopped like that once, the boy said, returning to his math homework. He was driving home from his night shift at the hospital. Cop didn't believe he was really a doctor. These conversations happened throughout the day, each one peeling back another layer of understanding. People shared their stories, not with anger, but with a hope that maybe this time someone was finally listening. During his lunch break, Miller sat alone, processing everything he was learning. Officer Thompson, now assigned as his mentor, joined him with 2 cups of coffee. Rough morning? Thompson asked, sliding 1 cup over. They all have stories, Miller replied, staring into his coffee. Every single person here has a story about being stopped, questioned, or harassed by police. Some of them might have been me. Thompson nodded. That's why the commissioner put you here. It's one thing to read about bias in a training manual. It's another to look in the eyes of the people affected by it. The afternoon brought more challenges. Miller joined a community discussion group where residents could openly share their experiences with law enforcement. He sat quietly in the back, as instructed, just listening. A middle-aged man stood up to speak, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've taught my kids exactly what to do if they're stopped by police." Hands visible. No sudden movements. "Yes, sir. No, sir." They shouldn't have to learn that before learning to drive. Each story hit Miller like a physical blow. He remembered his own traffic stops, the assumptions he'd made, the fear he'd caused. The faces in his arrest record were no longer just statistics. They were people with families, jobs, and lives he'd disrupted. Near the end of the day, the community center director handed him a broom. "Floor needs sweeping," she said simply. As Miller swept, he noticed small details he'd missed before: photos on the walls showing decades of community history, bulletin boards packed with job listings and educational opportunities, sign-up sheets for volunteer programs. Just before closing, the grandmother from that morning returned. She watched him sweeping for a moment before speaking. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Miller paused, leaning on the broom. "I'm trying to be," he answered honestly. She studied him for a moment longer. "Well, we need help with the after-school program. Kids could use someone to teach them about safety, but in a good way. If you're interested." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an opportunity, one small chance to start making things right. As Miller locked up the community center that evening, he realized this was just the beginning of a very long journey. Walking to his car, he passed a group of kids playing basketball in the fading light. One of them waved, and Miller waved back, feeling something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. 3 months into his rehabilitation program, Miller sat in a mandatory counseling session, his 6th one this month. The department psychologist listened patiently as he described his latest experiences at the community center. "Yesterday, one of the kids I tutored got perfect marks on his math test," Miller said, a hint of pride in his voice. "When he started, he could barely understand fractions. Now he's teaching other kids." The psychologist nodded, making notes. "You sound different than when we first started these sessions. Tell me more about how your perspective has changed." Miller gazed out the window, gathering his thoughts. "Remember that first session? I kept saying I was just doing my job, following procedures. But I wasn't, was I? I was following my biases, making up reasons to stop people who didn't look like they belonged in certain neighborhoods." A knock on the door interrupted them. Commissioner Washington entered, carrying a thick folder. "Mind if I join today's session?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Officer Miller," she began, opening the folder, "I've been reviewing your progress reports. The community center director speaks highly of your work with the youth program. Your new arrest records show more discernment, better judgment, but I'm more interested in hearing your own assessment." Miller shifted in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "I used to think being a good cop meant making lots of arrests, maintaining authority. Now I realize it's about building trust, understanding the community we serve." "And what about that authority?" Dr. Washington pressed. "How do you view it now?" "It's not about power over people," Miller replied, thinking of all the faces he'd come to know at the community center. "It's about responsibility to people. Every time we put on the badge, we're making a promise to protect and serve everyone equally." The psychologist leaned forward. "Tell us about your most challenging moment these past months." Miller's expression grew serious. "Last week, one of our senior center regulars, Mrs. Chen, told me about her grandson. He wants to be a police officer, but she's scared for him because he's Asian American. She asked me if I thought things could really change." "And what did you tell her?" Commissioner Washington asked quietly. "I told her about my own journey, about how I'm learning and changing. I promised her that when her grandson joins the force, officers like me will have his back, not because of what he looks like, but because of the badge we share and the community we serve." Dr. Washington studied him for a long moment. "Officer Miller, next week marks the halfway point of your rehabilitation program. I'm considering putting you back on limited patrol duty, partnered with Officer Thompson." Miller straightened in his chair, but his response wasn't what it might have been 3 months ago. "Commissioner, I appreciate the offer, but I'd like to continue my community center hours even after returning to patrol. These kids are counting on me for their tutoring sessions." A slight smile crossed Dr. Washington's face. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. She stood, straightening her jacket. Report to Officer Thompson tomorrow morning. Your shift will be split between patrol and community service. As she reached the door, she turned back. Oh, and Miller? Mrs. Chen's grandson. He's entering the police academy next month. I expect you to help make sure he finds a department worthy of his service. After they left, Miller sat quietly, processing everything. Through the window, he could see new recruits training in the yard below. Once, he'd seen only uniforms and badges. Now he saw individuals, each with their own stories, their own reasons for serving. His phone buzzed, a text from one of his tutoring students about tomorrow's session. As he typed a response, Miller realized that for the first time in his career, he wasn't just wearing the badge. He was finally beginning to understand what it truly meant to earn it. Back on patrol, but with a new perspective, Miller sat in the passenger seat while Officer Thompson drove through their assigned sector. The familiar streets looked different now, not just as places to watch for trouble, but as communities filled with people he'd come to know. Remember your first week as a rookie? Thompson asked, turning down Oak Street. You couldn't wait to make your first arrest. Now look at you, spending your lunch breaks teaching kids algebra. Miller smiled, thinking about how much had changed. Speaking of which, we should swing by the community center. The basketball tournament's today, and I promised the kids I'd stop by. As they pulled into the center's parking lot, dozens of young players in colorful jerseys were warming up. Several kids waved excitedly when they spotted Miller's patrol car. Parents who once eyed him with suspicion now nodded in greeting. Officer Mike, called out a young boy, running over. Are you gonna watch us play? I've been practicing those free throws you showed me. Wouldn't miss it, Miller replied, high-fiving the kid. Just doing a quick patrol first. Save me a seat in the bleachers. Back in the car, Thompson shook his head, grinning. Never thought I'd see the day. You know, the commissioner's been using your case as an example in her departmental reform presentations. Before Miller could respond, their radio crackled. A report came in about a suspicious vehicle in an upscale neighborhood. The description matched the exact type of call that would have sent the old Miller Racing to make an arrest. What's your call? Thompson asked, watching his partner carefully. Miller thought for a moment. Let's respond, but let's do it right. No lights, no sirens. Let's assess the situation before making any assumptions. They arrived to find a black SUV parked outside a large house. A well-dressed man was unloading groceries from the vehicle. 6 months ago, Miller might have jumped to conclusions. Now, he approached calmly, introduced himself, and asked polite questions. The man turned out to be the homeowner, a local business owner who'd recently moved to the neighborhood. The call had come from a neighbor who didn't recognize him. Instead of escalating the situation, Miller took the opportunity to introduce himself as the area's patrol officer and welcome the man to the community. That's how it's done, Thompson said as they drove away. De-escalation, respect, and common sense. Later that afternoon, they returned to the community center for the basketball tournament. The gym was packed with families cheering on their kids. Miller spotted Mrs. Chen in the crowd, sitting with her grandson who was home from the police academy. During a break in the games, the young cadet approached Miller. My grandmother tells me you're the reason I decided to stick with the academy, he said. She said you showed her that things really can change. Miller felt the weight of those words. Just remember, he replied, the badge isn't about power, it's about service. Your background, your perspective, they're not limitations. Their strengths are department needs. As the tournament wrapped up, Miller helped clean up the gym. A photo caught his eye on the community center's bulletin board. It was from his first day here, awkwardly holding a broom, looking lost and out of place. Next to it was a recent picture of him helping kids with their homework, his smile genuine and comfortable. Quite a difference, isn't it? Commissioner Washington's voice came from behind him. She'd stopped by to watch the tournament too. But the real change isn't in those photos. It's in how you see the world now and how the world sees you. Miller nodded, watching as the last families left the gym, calling out goodbyes and see you tomorrows. He'd started this journey thinking it was punishment. Somewhere along the way, it had become transformation. Ready to head back out, Thompson called from the doorway. Miller took one last look at the photos, straightened his badge, and walked toward his partner, ready to serve his community all of it with new eyes and an open heart. 5 months into his rehabilitation program, Miller stood before a crowd at the police academy, sharing his story with a new class of recruits. Commissioner Washington had asked him to speak about his experience, turning his mistake into a teaching moment for future officers. "I used to think being a good cop meant having the most arrests," he began, his voice carrying across the quiet auditorium. "I was wrong. Dead wrong. And it took getting called out by the very person who would become our commissioner to make me see it." The recruits sat in rapt attention as Miller described that rainy night, the baseless traffic stop, and the arrest that changed everything. He didn't sugarcoat his actions or make excuses. Instead, he laid bare his biases and their consequences. "But here's the real story," he continued, pacing slowly across the stage. "It's not about my mistake. It's about what happened after. About learning to see the community we serve as people, not statistics. About understanding that every traffic stop, every interaction, leaves a lasting impact on someone's life." In the front row, Mrs. Chen's grandson nodded, taking notes. Behind him sat a diverse group of future officers, each bringing their own perspectives and experiences to the force. "Yesterday," Miller said, "I ran into someone I'd arrested 2 years ago. Before my wake-up call, he was dropping his daughter off at the community center where I volunteer. You know what he did? He thanked me. Not for arresting him, that was just as biased as my other stops. He thanked me for changing, for showing his daughter that people, even cops, can learn and grow." A hand raised in the audience. "But how do we avoid making these mistakes in the first place?" Miller smiled. "By doing what you're doing right now, listening. By questioning your assumptions. By remembering that the power of your badge comes with the responsibility to protect and serve everyone equally." After the lecture, Commissioner Washington joined him in the hallway. "Good session," she said. "But I heard something interesting in there. You said even cops can learn and grow. Want to elaborate on that?" Miller considered her question carefully. "When I started this program, I thought it was about becoming a better police officer. But it's been about becoming a better person. The uniform doesn't define us. Our actions do." They walked together through the academy halls, passing photos of graduating classes through the years. "Next week's your final evaluation," the commissioner reminded him. "Any thoughts?" "Just one," Miller replied. "Whatever the outcome, I want to keep working with the community center. Those kids, those families, they're not just part of my rehabilitation anymore. They're part of who I am now." Later that day, Miller sat in his car outside the police station, looking at 2 photos on his phone. The first showed him at his academy graduation, young and proud, thinking he knew everything about being a cop. The second was from last week's community center basketball league finale, surrounded by smiling kids and parents who now saw him as part of their community. A knock on his window startled him. It was the businessman from the suspicious vehicle call months ago. "Officer Miller, got a minute?" The man had become a regular volunteer at the community center after that incident. "My son wants to apply to the police academy," he said. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk with him about your experience." As Miller agreed to meet with the young man, he realized something profound. His journey hadn't just changed him, it was creating ripples that would affect the next generation of officers. His phone buzzed with a text from Officer Thompson, "Ready for night patrol." Miller looked at the message, then at the community center visible in the distance, its lights glowing warmly in the evening sky. "Ready," he typed back. And for the first time in his career, he truly was ready to serve, ready to protect, and most importantly, ready to continue learning from the community that had taught him so much. On the final day of his rehabilitation program, Miller sat across from Commissioner Washington, his evaluation folder between them. 6 months had passed since that rainy night when he'd made the biggest mistake, and ultimately, the most important turning point of his career. "I've reviewed everything," Dr. Washington began, opening the folder. "Your community service hours, patrol reports, feedback from Officer Thompson, testimonials from community center residents. Even got a letter from Mrs. Chen's grandson at the academy." Miller sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. The office looked different now, no longer intimidating, but familiar. The morning sun streamed through the window, just like it had on that first day when he'd faced the consequences of his actions. "Tell me," the commissioner said, leaning back in her chair, "what's the most important lesson you've learned these past 6 months?" Miller didn't need to think about his answer. That real change isn't about policies or procedures. It's about people. Every person I've stopped, every kid I've tutored, every family I've met, they've taught me more about being a police officer than any training manual could. Dr. Washington nodded, pulling out one final document. That's why I'm not just signing off on your rehabilitation completion. I'm recommending you for a new position we're creating, Community Relations Training Officer. Miller's eyes widened. Ma'am, you'll split your time between regular patrol duties and training other officers in community engagement. The program you went through? We're expanding it. Every officer will now spend time at community centers learning what you learned. She slid the paper across her desk. Your story from that traffic stop to today will be part of our new training curriculum. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've learned from their mistakes. Miller looked at the document, remembering all the moments that had led to this one. The teenage boy who shared his uncle's story. The grandmother who gave him a chance with the after-school program. The businessman who now trusted him to mentor his son. There's one more thing, Dr. Washington added, standing up. Follow me. They walked to the community center, where Miller was surprised to find the gym packed with people. His tutoring students, the basketball team, senior center regulars, fellow officers, all gathered together. Officer Miller, one of his students, stepped forward, holding something in his hands. We heard you're officially graduating today. We wanted to give you this. It was a framed photo collage, pictures from the past 6 months. Miller teaching math, playing basketball, helping with groceries, patrolling the neighborhood. In the center was a recent photo of him and Dr. Washington at a community meeting, both smiling as they talked with residents. 6 months ago, I arrested someone for no reason other than my own bias. Miller addressed the crowd, his voice thick with emotion. That person could have ended my career. Instead, she showed me how to save it, not just for myself, but for the community I serve. Commissioner Washington stepped forward. The true measure of justice isn't in how we punish mistakes, but in how we learn from them. Officer Miller's journey isn't just his story, it's an example of what real police reform looks like. As the gathering turned into an impromptu celebration, Miller watched the scene around him. Officer Thompson chatting with community members, his tutoring students showing their improved grades to their parents. Mrs. Chen's grandson, now nearly finished with the academy, discussing community policing with veteran officers. Later, as Miller walked to his patrol car for his evening shift, he paused to look at his reflection in the window. His badge caught the setting sun, shining brightly. But now it wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a reminder of responsibility, of growth, and of the continuous journey toward being the kind of officer his community deserved. He got in his car, adjusted his mirror, and smiled. Tonight's patrol wasn't an end to his story, it was just the beginning of a new chapter in a much larger one.